Welcome back to A View from the Chair. I am your host, Patrice Jordan Robinson, member of the Memphis City Council, chairwoman of the council as well, and I represent District 3. So, why do I do this podcast? It is my goal and intent that A View from the Chair is to allow not just some citizens, but all citizens access to information from city, community, health, and business leaders who, in some cases, assist your elected officials with formulating policies affecting the entire community. I am so excited about my guest today because this is a topic that we don't normally talk about here in our community, and you'll find out in just a minute. But without any further delay, our guests today are Dr. Lora J. McGill. She is a doctor and a FAAN, and she'll have to tell you what that means. Lead Principal Investigator with CNS Healthcare, and Mr. Ammon Brookins. He's a project manager for clinical trials. And our focus today will be on clinical trial participation and how it affects and impacts persons of color with respect to clinical trials. I'd like to welcome each one of them on today because this is so important to our community, especially in the midst of COVID-19. So, welcome to A View from the Chair, Dr. McGill and Dr. Brookins.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. I am online, sir. Will y'all please excuse me? Well, welcome back to A View from the Chair. So, as your host, we had a little snafu. My husband was in the background. So, just wanted to say again, welcome to both of you. So, I want to just jump right in. So, Dr. McGill and Mr. Brookins, and we can take ladies first. Uh, just tell the listeners and the viewers today a little bit about your background so they'll know who you are and how you began to work with clinical trials.
Well, as you stated earlier, I am an MD. I'm a neurologist, and those initials at the end stand for a fellow of the American Academy of Neurology. So it's sort of one of the other accolades that I guess you put behind your name after you accomplish something. But the main thing is that I'm a regular doctor here in Memphis. I've been practicing in Memphis for a little over 25 years. I relocated here um, and made my home here and have raised my family here. And my interest in research really started even when I was, pre um, medical years, where I just liked learning about things and I wanted to find out about things. And I got interested in research as a medical student. And when I came to Memphis, I joined the faculty at the University of Tennessee and became a teacher there for medical students. And I didn't get a chance to do very much research because I was pretty busy with that actually. And when I finally decided to go into private practice, I had an opportunity to join a company that was doing medical research through clinical trials. So I started doing that about 1 day a week, just on the side while I was doing my private practice, and I loved it so much. And I really, really, I think, took a liking to it, and I was good at it. And so eventually, I closed my private practice that was in South Haven, Mississippi, and I went into clinical research full time. So I've been with CNS Healthcare for almost 20 years now, doing clinical trials. I've participated in hundreds of clinical trials for various conditions. And the thing I really love about it is that I get to take care of patients every day. And I also get to be involved in cutting edge research to find out about medications that can help, medications that might change the lives of people. And it gives me a very I think, insightful view of what we can do as a community, what we can do as a medical community, kind of outside the traditional medical practice that also impacts people's health in their lives every day. So that's kind of how I got in research, and I really love what I'm doing, and I'm excited to be with you today because I do think it's something we need to let people know about. It's very little understanding, I think, in the general community about how clinical trials work and the importance of them and the ability to participate, actually the need for us to participate in them.
Thank you, Mr. Brookins.
Sure. Thank you again. So I know I'm currently listed as a project manager for clinical trials. For those that are in research, the title could be different depending on the company that you're working with and the scope of the responsibilities. I like to call myself a site manager or a site monitor. So such as Dr. McGill, who's she oversees clinical trials at her site. She's the lead investigator for a particular trial that she participates on. My role in clinical research involves me actually going on site. I'm the eyes of the pharmaceutical company, which we would call the sponsor or the contract research organization who would be contracted by the sponsor to oversee the conduct of the clinical trial, sometimes from discovery all the way until it's approved by the FDA and brought on the market. So when I would visit a clinical research site, my job is to actually monitor and ensure the safety and efficacy, ensuring that number one, that there is oversight for those patients, but number two, ensure that the site is actually following the guidelines, whether it's local or federal, but also the protocols that are written or guidance for the sites to follow for those patients. And pretty much, I'm just ensuring that the sites are FDA ready. And that's what I tell people, that I'm the FDA before the FDA. And so if I were to work with Dr. McGill at one of her sites, we actually would work together. We're a unit, and it's just my job to ensure that if there's any issues that I find, I help them reconcile those issues and make suggestions. If they have any issues, it's my job. I'm like a middleman to go back to the sponsor or my contract research organization and discuss with them the site's concerns and how that we can better ensure quality data, because number one, it's about quality data, but also it's also about patient safety and ensuring we can ensure efficacy, but if we have quality data, it can ensure that the FDA can review that data and possibly approve that trial. Now, my interest in clinical trials actually started after college in 2005. I managed the blood plasma center, and speaking of blood plasma, right now during COVID-19, blood plasma is a very big deal now, especially for donors who donate plasma who have been affected or tested positive for COVID-19. They're actually paying those donors more money because they need blood plasma, which we call liquid gold, to help find therapies or even vaccines. So I never knew that it would come back full circle from 2007 when we worked in the Blood Plasma Center. Well, I started getting recruitment calls about this job I've never heard of or career path called a clinical research associate that involved travel and clinical trials. I didn't know what clinical trials were, but I didn't know what clinical research was in general or research. I never considered myself one interested in looking under a microscope, but all I knew was it paid more money than what I was making, and that I could travel the United States and actually learn something new. But I wasn't qualified other than education. So I took a position in preclinical research, and preclinical research is research on animals. And so, for those of you watching that are not aware of this, there's not a drug on the market today that was not tested on animals first. Animals have their rights just like human rights, and preclinical trials are governed just like clinical trials. There are different phases, and we must, in the industry, test on animals first to ensure that it's possibly safe to test on humans in the early stages of those trials. After 3 years of working in genetic toxicology, and that's looking at the effects of raw compounds that could potentially be drugs on the and see how those raw compounds affects human blood and animal blood cells and chromosomes, I actually got an opportunity to be a site manager internally for clinical studies where I manage regulatory documents for sites. I always told them that, hey, I want to actually monitor the sites. I want to be on site. I want to look at data. I want to find errors. And I want to actually see the actual results of the research and how it actually advances life and ensures that people have a better life, because that's really the purpose of designing these different drugs and compounds. After a year of working internally, regulatory wise, I actually became a monitoring assistant where I just was doing internal documents and writing different documents, and pretty much like a project manager assistant. And then after a year of that, they promoted me to a CRA1, which is a clinical research associate one. And it was my entry level into actually clinical research and monitoring clinical trials. 12 years later, I'm at a senior level. I enjoy what I do. There's ups and downs, but it's definitely rewarding because you get to meet a lot of interesting people around the United States and around the world, because a lot of trials are actually being conducted internationally, and you may get an opportunity to work in other countries as well.
Thank you. You all gave us a really broad perspective, and the audience will also know that there's a process to get to either level that you want to. I am so happy to have both of you here with me today. And I want to know, can you give us some insight into the reason why larger pools of people of color don't participate in clinical trials? And our concern as an audience and as a city council is that, we want to make sure that we have safe vaccines, especially now that we're in COVID-19. And
Yes.
we want to know that we have people of color participated in those trials, because we want to make sure that we are represented. Dr. McGill and then Mr. Brookins.
Well, I think that's the question of the day, isn't it?
Yes.
And it's actually something we've been quite aware of for many, many years. We've always known that just like there are inequities in many, many, many of our systems in the United States, really in the world, but specifically in the United States, there are inequities in clinical research. And we know that if we are not counted and included in clinical research, then we don't really know if these drugs or these medications or all of these discoveries that we are making really apply to us. So I can give you a prime example. Most people are aware about cancer research. We talk about cancer a lot more openly than we, did back in the day, for example. And a lot of the clinical research that was done on some cancer medicines in the early phases were really done specifically with very, very small groups of minority patients included. And it sort of depends on where the trial is done, who's doing the trial, the efforts that they make to recruit African Americans, African Americans or other minorities. It's not just African Americans, other minorities or disadvantaged people. They don't just naturally find research. They don't just naturally come to it. And I think that if you don't make a concerted effort to include minorities, they will be a very small percentage of participants in clinical trials. The other issue that I think is very important to recognize is that we now understand that medicines do act differently sometimes in different populations, whether it's age, gender, or race. And of course, now that we have different races, we have mixtures of races, how do you expect some medications to act in different people? And there's a lot of research going on to find out about how our genetic makeup may influence how we respond to medications and drugs. So now that we've kind of come into this time of personalized medicine, making a medicine that's specific for you or specific for your, genetic makeup or your blood type maybe, or specific for an ethnic group, we now recognize the value of trying to do that intentionally. As a matter of fact, I'll give you a great example right now. The COVID-19 trials that we are in the process of trying to bring to Memphis have mandated that there has to be a significant portion of minority participation. And they will not look favorably up on sites that don't recruit minorities, because we understand that that's necessary. So the FDA is actually starting to make pharmaceutical companies focus on getting more minorities into their trials. Back in the day, I remember having a research study that was called Alzheimer's disease in African Americans. And there was kind of some controversy about that. You know, why do we need to make it specific for African Americans? And isn't that biased? But the problem was that people in Alzheimer's research had recognized that there were very few African Americans participating in the trials for the drugs that had already been approved. And they wanted to make sure that African Americans were included. So rather than trying to make a specific trial for a specific group and having to put the name on it so that people will think first, let me try to find African Americans, or try to find, disadvantaged patients, or we can just say every research study that's going on must focus on bringing in more minorities. And I'm really glad to hear it. Memphis, our Memphis site has always been um, probably better than the average as far as recruiting minority participants in the trials. I think some of that is because of the Memphis population, obviously having a high percentage of minorities. That definitely helps. But I think if you looked at other sites in town, you may not find that they have the same proportion of minorities participating as we do. I haven't done research on that, so don't quote me. It's just sort of a feeling that I have. But our office is very diverse as far as the people working there. So I think it does make a difference when you go someplace what your research staff looks like with your comfort level of being there. So I think it's important because, number one, we have to be included to make sure that the medicines work for us. Number two, there are lots of great advantages to participating in clinical trials. So why would we want to be left out of that? And the third thing is that I think that if we're going to try to talk about equity anywhere in the world, we need to talk about equity in every system that we have, including healthcare and the clinical research system.
Thank you, Mr. Brookins.
Thank you. I actually think about this topic often, actually being on the site level and monitoring sites and looking at how disproportionate it is for minorities who actually participate in research, but also minorities that conduct clinical trials in the science field as well. And I think they are related. So I wrote down a couple of actual points that I think are some of the issues with our demographic and research. Number one is mistrust. And I think we're going to talk about it later. And that's just past history of experimentation with minorities that were kind of brutal or considered unethical. So I'm 38 years old, but I know that when I speak with my elders, my dad, he passed away with pancreatic cancer. Even though the mortality rate for pancreatic cancer was low, and his life expectancy was very low, and he was suffering, the thought of being in a clinical trial that could possibly extend his life 6 months, he wasn't having it. I'm not going to be a lab rat. You're not going to be sticking all on me. And I'm like, Dad, you're being stuck anyway. You're already taking chemotherapy, and I'm sure that was tested on someone. So it's kind of like returning a favor, especially for those that are suffering from terminal illness. It's really important to not only people are trying to find cures, but they're also trying to extend life and better the quality of life. My second point is lack of awareness. I've noticed that when traveling and visiting monitoring sites, sometimes the site could be at a academic institution. The site could be a private practice. The site can be a clinical research facility, and seldom the site could be a clinic. And so, what I find with our demographic is a lot of patients who are aware of what clinical trials are out there find out that information from their primary care physician, who just happens to participate as an investigator or sub-investigator in clinical trials, or has a colleague that is participating in clinical trials. Now, speaking of a primary care physician, a lot of people don't have a primary care physician. I know myself, I have insurance, but I don't have a primary care physician. I typically find it convenient to go to a clinic. But unfortunately, when I go to a clinic, most clinicians at a clinic, they don't have the time to spend in clinical research. So unless you're actually going to a physician who actually is involved in clinical research, you're likely not going to get that information. Um, my next point is lack of communication and economic factors. When I go to sites, and I work in cardiovascular disease, I also work in Alzheimer's as well as insomnia trials. So I have CNS background as well. But a clinical trial can have an age range between 18 and 80 years old, 75 years old. And I typically see older patients, especially when it comes to heart issues. Some of these patients are so old that they cannot get to the clinic by themselves. Even if there is small type of compensation for participating, in some in minority communities, there's a lack of access or resources to get to the clinical site, even if they wanted to participate. So even if they started, sometimes you will see patients are lost to follow up or removed from the trial because they can't adhere to the guidelines of the study because they have no one to actually bring them. So if I were to put it in a category, I would say it's the mistrust of research, then it's the lack of awareness, and it trickles down to just the resources we have, and if we're even going to the doctor to get that information. And then there's economic factors and communication issues. But I wanted to bring up one point that women and minorities were not actually written into law to participate in clinical trials until 1993. So listen to this again. The NIH, the National Institute of Health, wrote a policy for not African Americans, but women and minorities to participate in clinical trials in their policy between 1989 and 1993. But it wasn't until 1993 that minorities and women were actually written into law to participate. So that means that any research done by minorities or women prior to was not regulated the same as it is today. And when you look at the household today, when you look at single parent households, and these are women. So if you think about it, if a lot of households are mostly women, and women just were recently approved to participate in clinical trials, there's a wealth of misunderstanding and lack of understanding from those who are in our household to even understand why they should participate.
Now, you have just stunned me to find out that African American women were not participating in clinical trials, not because we weren't aware, because we could not. So how do I know how the medication impacts me until I take the medicine? That is ridiculous.
Right, right.
Oh my God. Community,
Can I add
listen up. Yes.
one other point is um, not it's not just the fact that minorities and women were not actually written into law until 1993, but women are a special case because women can bear children. And so it's very important that and Dr. McGill can agree that, in our consent, it's very important to speak about women of childbearing potential, because we don't know and want to run a risk of what that drug or compound can do to the offspring of a child. So if a woman were to become pregnant, it has to be alerted. If a man was in a clinical trial and got a woman pregnant, he would need to let the Dr. McGill know, and they probably would like to do tests on the woman over a certain period of time. So when you see a drug and they have these billion-dollar lawsuits and a child was born with cerebral palsy due to a drug that's been approved, most people think, oh, well, they already knew that was going to happen. And the thing is, there's no way that we could have known that was going to happen, because we would never let a woman pregnant be in a clinical trial. The only offspring we can do research on is offspring of animals, and that's called developmental and reproductive toxicology, and that's done on animals looking at their offspring. But as with human trials, We would never allow a woman to participate in a trial who was pregnant because we don't want the potential of unknown side effect to affect the offspring. Now, 10 years down the line, there's a greater demographic and tens of thousands of millions of people over a longer span period that's probably longer than the trial. And now you start to see unexpected serious adverse events or reactions, what we might call side effects, and there's no way we can know, So I just wanted to share that information.
Dr. McGill, anything you'd like to share?
Well, yes, and thank you for asking me, Madam Chair. I think one of the things I want to try to make clear is that women and minorities were participating in clinical trials long before this period of time. But I think the point that Mr. Brookins really raises for our awareness is that if we are just allowed to do what comes naturally and let things kind of flow how we think they should flow, things don't always turn out so equitably. And so I think what I'm going to say now is something that's important for the whole national narrative, is that it's important for things to be put into policy and sometimes into law in order to raise awareness of those who are, say, involved, to just sort of do the right thing. You would think it would come naturally to say include women and minorities, but it doesn't really come naturally in some settings. So if you make a law or a policy, that is a little bit better chance of evening the playing field. So I do think that's important. And I agree 100% with what he said, that we need to have all people participate. Our office has been doing clinical trials for, like I said, almost 20 years. And we have done clinical trials in children, in elders, in teenagers. We do clinical trials for all types of disorders, both medical and psychiatric, dermatologic, cardiovascular, men's health, women's health. So we cover as much territory as possible. And of course, I want to do as much research as we can because I really would love to include as many people as we can. But there is a very rigorous oversight. There's a lot of sort of rules and regulations that have to be followed. But I do think that the policy that he just mentioned, it is jaw-dropping. And there are lots of things like that in research. The things that have been tragic that I found out about research, and we're going to talk about the mistrust, and I think that's, I'll wait until we get to that part. But of the things that have been tragic about research that have hurt me so greatly, there have also been some wonderful highs, some great, accomplishments, and some, oh my gosh, look what we did together kinds of moments in research, which is one of the reasons that I really, really love doing it.
And when I opened up, I shared with the viewing and listening audience that it's individuals like you and Mr. Brookins that bring this information to life for elected officials and legislators so that we can do what we need to do to make this a more equitable endeavor. And this leads me directly to my next question. Dr. McGill, let's talk a little bit about the Tuskegee study and Henrietta Lacks and how the way those studies were carried out may affect participants' attitudes today.
Okay. So Mr. Brookins hit on the first one of his points, which he put in a very succinct way. Thank you so much for that, Mr. Brookins, because I think he's right about the mistrust. And I remember when I first got into research and I found out about some of these things, and I found out about some of them even before I did research. And I learned more about them, of course, later on. But when I first found out about some of those things, besides being extremely shocked and feeling that they were unbelievable, I recognized that even if you never heard of the Tuskegee experiment, as we call it, or the Tuskegee study, even if you never heard of it specifically, you have a general idea that things have been done that were inappropriate, that were disgraceful, that were even sometimes life-threatening to African Americans who were trying to participate in research, or they were tricked into participating in research. And so it does leave a very strong feeling in the whole community, especially African Americans, that we pass down to each other. A lot of things in the African American community are, verbal kind of stories that we pass down and pass down. I mean, you may not know the premise or the basis for why it happened, but you pretty much know it's true because you heard it from whoever, you know, your uncle or your grandparents, or, you know, back in the day they did this, and those things are true. So even when you don't understand the specific incidents, you kind of have a general feeling of mistrust. And one of the things that we have to do is we have to address the mistrust, legitimize it, and then we have to say, how do we move on from here? So the Tuskegee experiment started in the 1930s with a group of men who were African American who had contracted syphilis, and the public health Service of the United States wanted to study syphilis natural history, like how did it evolve, how did it progress, how would it do, because we didn't have a treatment for syphilis at the time. And they made the decision that they wanted to involve minorities, which is a good thing. We want to involve minorities. And they studied these men. They gave them free health care. They, gave them lots of perks for participating. They had Black nurses and doctors sometimes helping them. Of course, they had special privileges that they would give these people because they agreed to participate in the research. The problem is that it started to go awry. And so what happened is around 1950s, when treatment became available for syphilis, these men still were not offered treatment. And there were decision points about should we treat them, because we're following, and they stuck with their initial premise, which was to see how syphilis does if it's untreated. And they let these men continue to be untreated. They let people continue to be infected with syphilis, which now was treatable and preventable even. And this experiment actually went on into the 1970s when somebody finally said, hey, this is not right, brought it to public attention. There was an outcry, and of course it was ended. And then later on in the 1990s, President Clinton gave an official apology because it was done through the Public Health of America. So I think that one is probably the one a lot of people refer to. We called it bad blood. The legendary thing in the African community is I have bad blood. And that was because that's how they checked for syphilis. If your blood had the positive titer, they called it, quote, bad blood. So that was really obviously an American tragedy. And it happened because the experiment started so long ago and it didn't end until it was a 40-year experiment. That is probably one of the greatest embarrassments in American healthcare. It's not the only one. I have to tell you, there are many of them. The story about Henrietta Lacks is a little more modern, but it's still from the 1950s. And she was a woman who was African American, and she developed cervical cancer, and she went to the Johns Hopkins Hospital where they found it. And when they found the cancer, just like they would with everybody else, they took a specimen, a biopsy. They treated her with the standard treatment that was available at that time. So her treatment was probably the appropriate type of treatment. But the thing is that they kept the cells that they took from her without her permission, without her consent, and they used those cells to give to other people, because what they found out about her cells, these cells that turned out to be something miraculous, that they grew very easily outside of the body. And it advanced research by leaps and bounds because they now had a cell line that they could follow, that they could monitor, that they could experiment on, that they could learn about new drugs, that they could learn about new treatments. And all of this information came from this African-American woman who was disadvantaged, who had not given her permission for this to happen. And these cells were sent all over the world. These cells are famous now. They're called HeLa cells. That stands for the first two letters of Henrietta and the last two Lacks. They call them HeLa cells. And these cells were being used worldwide almost even before her death. She did eventually die of this cancer because it was a rapidly progressing form. And there are lots of theories on why her cell line grew when other cell lines wouldn't. But, this tragedy, it was a tragedy. She was never compensated for that. Her family fought for that. The Oprah made the movie about Henrietta Lacks and her legacy to health science. Again, a tragic story that has almost turned into some type of miracle, if you want to look at it that way. Cells are this day. Um, snatchers and doing medical movies contribute to our kind of mistrust of the system. And I'm sure Mr. Brookins can agree with me. There is no way that those kinds of things can happen today. There is so much oversight and independent regulations and governing bodies. Sometimes it's hard to get a research study off the ground because of all of this oversight that must happen. And remember, I told you about policies and regulations. If they're not in place, it makes it harder to make sure things are done right and properly. So as tragic as those things are, they can happen today. And it does take people like me and Mr. Brookins and you for bringing this awareness to our community to go out and let people know, yes, those things are true, but now this is what we will do to make sure that that never happens again, because we can't stay on the outside of research any longer. We have to come in, we have to be counted, we have to be included.
Thank you, Dr. McGill, for sharing that bit of history. And I can't wait uh, to hear the feedback that we get from this podcast, and especially from young people. Mr. Brookins, I certainly don't want to leave you out of this conversation. As a project manager working in clinical trials, do we as a community put enough emphasis on our young people pursuing STEM careers, which I'm sure in most cases would help in filling the needed vacancies in the healthcare field and especially clinical trials?
My answer is yes and no. Um, those
Uh-oh.
that don't know, STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Okay, so my background in school, I've always was interested in science. Basically, I was interested in chemistry, biology, physical science, and when I went to college, I majored in biology, pre-medicine. Now, my school didn't offer a lot of different avenues or different areas of biology. It was just simply biology, not microbiology, molecular biology, etc. So when it comes to STEM, I think we're doing a great job in nurturing students with those interests and providing different programs in science, mathematics, engineering, and technology. I think the problem when you say the community, I want to hold businesses that's in science, biotechnology companies, engineering companies. I want to hold businesses accountable because I feel that although we have children that are interested in science and math and technology and engineering, I believe that we're limited in what types of companies and businesses and career options that are out there when it comes to recruiting kids that are in college or discussing avenues. When I was in school, all I knew about was nurses, doctor, dentist. 10 years after graduating from college, I started hearing about clinical research and physician assistant. When I heard about physician assistant, that was from someone in medical school, and they said, Carlos, why not be a physician assistant? You can almost, it's like being a doctor in 2 years. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I didn't know what she was talking about, but I'm like, why don't I know about this? It's been 10 years since I've graduated from college. And if I wanted to take that path, I would have to go back to school and take all of the prerequisites over again. But imagine if I knew about it while I was actually in school. When you go to these career fairs, there are not a lot of industry that's there recruiting. Uh, I worked for a lot of contract research organizations, and I noticed that when they would hire interns or bring in interns and who they would hire, they only go to specific schools. They may just go to Vanderbilt only. They may just go to the higher level schools, not thinking about the actual interest of people from all types of schools and different demographics or minorities, because some people actually will take a job just as an entry level position, knowing that they want to do something totally different. While there's someone else in the background who actually wants to do this as a career and spend their life in research versus, hey, this is a good opportunity. I work in clinical research, but I really want to be a project manager and I don't care where I want to do it. So I believe that we need to start, let's say in Memphis, if we go and look at all of the biotech companies, the companies that make devices, the pharmaceutical companies, and hold them accountable and say, we want you to be reflected in our community from a level of going to speak to high school students, go to speak to college students, all the colleges. They should know, not just, for instance, you don't have to be in science or math, have a math background or a technical background, engineering background to work in biotechnology or science realm. They need analysts, they need quality assurance people, they need people with English backgrounds, they need people with finance backgrounds. So there, it's just that people need to be aware that these industries exist, and that if you've been in school for 5 years and thought you want to be a doctor, and then you realize you don't want to be a doctor, you shouldn't feel like you're lost and don't have any other options. You should
Right.
know, hey, I don't want to be a doctor, but I can do all these other things and they exist, and it may make me happier. And I found myself in that scenario when I realized I didn't want to be a doctor after 5 years of school, and I didn't know what to do. I'm like, am I going to teach? I didn't know what avenue to take, and luckily I discovered clinical research, and it's so many vast opportunities in science, math, technology, engineering, and mathematics that although we teach the kids and nurture their interest, they have to know what options they have after they put in all their time and effort, to become experts in that field.
Yeah. Very
I think you may be muted.
Thank you.
good.
I usually don't turn my mic off, but I'm having to turn it off because we've got some construction going on in my community, and I wanted to interfere with our podcast on today. So I appreciate what you just shared. I've spent many years on the school board trying to make sure that our young people had every opportunity that they could to learn and grow and be citizens that are productive in our community. And to me, sharing background, especially in science, technology, engineering, math, is so important. Not just those young people who are in STEM academies. All young people need to know so that they can broaden their horizons. So, Dr. McGill, I want to just change the subject just a little bit. We have information out there and we have misinformation. So, I saw on the news this week that we got a vaccine coming out of Russia. So, and it's supposed to be one for COVID-19. Can you remind us how important it is to have a diversified group population of people that participate in these trials? Because I'm not sure that what they've done in Russia included someone that looks like me.
Well, before I tell you about Russia, let me tell you about Memphis. I
Okay.
did allude to the fact that Memphis, our site specifically, has been um, vying to try to get a clinical trial for COVID-19. And we have been able to secure one trial for sure, and maybe two, to start doing COVID vaccine research here in Memphis. And I told you already that it is mandated, and I'm not concerned at all about the mandate because we already do it anyway, that we recruit as many minority patients as possible. So everybody is going to be invited to the party, and we specifically want to be able to have African Americans, minorities, and the age range across the gamut participating in these clinical trials, because you're right, we have to know if they work for us. The purpose of a clinical trial is not only to show if a drug works for the disorder, but to show if it doesn't work. Because if we find a drug that doesn't work, we need to stop wasting time on that drug and move on to another candidate. So that's kind of where we are with research on COVID-19 here in Memphis. Please stay aware, it's coming. But now back to Russia. Now, I wasn't there, of course. But we kind of know when the research would have probably started, although coronaviruses have been around for many, many years prior to 2020. or the end of 2019 when this virus became known. The research could not have possibly started any earlier than 2020 or the latter part of 2019. So it's a very, very short period of time for the answer to already be available. I'm not there, so I don't know, and I can't say what they found. They may have found a candidate that does work or have some efficacy, but we do know it probably was not tested in a very large percentage of the population. Um, so it is very important that trial, and I think Mr. Brookins alluded to it before, drugs start off in preclinical phase, they come to clinical phase, and they go through all of the phases of clinical trials. Now, phase 1, 2, 3, and 4 are the major phases of clinical trials that we do in humans. And the research studies in COVID-19 have gotten a lot of attention. There's a lot of regulation, a lot of oversight, and the FDA and the NIH together have gotten together and figured out a way to fast track this discovery, because we need the treatment now. This is not something we can sit back and wait for the standard 5, 8, or 12 years that it takes for some drugs to make it to market. We just don't have that kind of time. So everything has been fast tracked, but that doesn't mean that they're skipping steps. They're getting through them sooner. So they got the phase 1s and 2s done in a faster pace. They included lots of different pharmaceutical companies working together so we can still get great numbers of patients. So I will just tell you, I would be hesitant to say if they found the vaccine in Russia that we would be using it here in the US. And I think you've heard the authorities say that as well, that we are working hard to find a vaccine here in the United States, and probably very good at it, and we've advanced the cause quite a bit. So I think people would be very conservative or very hesitant to just jump right in and let's all take the vaccine from Russia. But I can't say that they haven't found something that's shown some efficacy. Whether it's the vaccine we would be taking here in the US is another story.
Okay, thank you. So, Mr. Brookins, is it remotely possible that Russia has actually come up with a vaccine for COVID-19, including all the necessary phases, especially phase 3 of the clinical trial testing?
Okay, I'm going to say this realistically. Okay, so my response is yes, it is remotely, definitely possible that they come up with a vaccine. Does it work? That's the question. Is it safe? That's the question. So it's just like saying I can build a car in my backyard right now doesn't mean that it works and I can sell it and it's safe for you to drive, right? The problem is, going back to what Dr. McGill mentioned, is there are 4 phases in a clinical trial, and billions of dollars could be spent on this trial during this time frame. I believe that when you look at when we first started finding out about COVID-19 and when they would have started the research, when you have a lot of money, you can expedite a process, you can work around the clock. But still, the average vaccine typically takes on average about 10 years. Now, the record of vaccine discovery was, I think, for the mumps, and it was about 4 years. Now, for the US, COVID-19, our goal is about 12 to 18 months. So when you look at the time frame, it seems unrealistic. My concern is the lack of safety and efficacy. Is it safe? Is it effective? They've completed, as mentioned before, phase 1 and 2. But my issue is it says that they've already approved it. It's approved, but now they're going to start phase 3 trials. And phase 3, progress in the phases, the population increases. By the time you get into a phase 3 trial, you can increase your patient pool by thousands to tens of thousands. And now your goal is to have greater demographic, but also you have a better opportunity to look at how safe it is and is it effective. But this trial in Russia is in a couple of other foreign countries. It's not here in the US. I don't believe we want to touch it. It doesn't make sense. And it's definitely unrealistic. So is there a vaccine? I believe it. Does it work? I don't think so. I highly doubt it. I don't. It's kind of they're working backwards. You don't approve it and say, I'm going to approve it because we got it, but now let's test it some more. No, you want to take it through this process. I mean, 12 to 18 months is still pretty fast when the record is 4 years. So to say, hey, we want to bring someone on the market in 3 months, that's insane.
Thank you. I have gotten a message that we've got to wrap up. This has been so much fun and it's been informative, and I appreciate both of you being here today. Uh, I want either of you or both of you to give us some closing remarks, some things that you want to stress. If you have a clinical trial that you want African American people to participate in, tell them how to do it and how to get involved. So I'm going to start with Dr. McGill, and just give us some closing remarks so that our audience will know how to use the information they learned on today.
Well, first of all, I really want to thank you for giving me an opportunity to participate in this venue. I think it's absolutely wonderful that the council is so interested in its constituents and the community and bringing all this kinds of knowledge. So thank you so much for having me. I do want to just make sure I make a couple of points. Number one, clinical trials are very important. And there are some advantages to participating in clinical trials for us as African Americans or minorities or women, and even for children, because we do get a chance to advance the cause of healthcare. There are opportunities for patients who participate to get free healthcare because they are not having to use health insurance to participate. There's no charge or fee. And you know, when we do all of the blood work and EKGs, and a lot of times I've done some evaluations on patients and found out medical conditions they had no idea that they had. And it saved lives at sometimes because they came to volunteer to participate in a research trial and they didn't have any other avenue for getting their, say, blood tests done or their EKGs are done. And we found out, okay, this is a medical issue that needs to be addressed. So there are lots of advantages to participating besides helping other people in the future maybe benefit from the medications that we approve. The other thing is that minorities and women and children and vulnerable populations can trust medical research right now. It is something that's being highly regulated, and you can trust the system. They make sure you're informed. You can ask questions. We want you to ask questions. We encourage you to ask questions at every turn. The opportunity to participate in clinical trials with us is very easy. If we have a clinical trial at the moment that you're interested in, you can call us. If we have a clinical trial that may be coming next year or the year after, we keep your name in a database and we start calling people when we get that. Now, for the COVID vaccine research study that we have going, we are wanting people from all walks of life, people with various medical conditions. There are some exclusions because we want to make sure that we don't hurt anyone or give it to someone who has a medical condition that would be contraindicated for you to get a vaccine. There are things that we would do to make sure you're healthy. That's why they hire doctors like me to run the clinical trial, because we have to take care of people and keep them healthy, as Mr. Brookins mentioned before. You can call our office 24/7 at 901-843-1045. That's 901-843-1045. We also have a website, cnshealthcare.com. You can go there, you can sign up, you can call in, you can make an appointment. Most times you can come in for the appointment within the same couple of days that you call, if not the same day. So it's very easy to get in and get the information about the trials and figure out if there's something that you can do to participate. I hope that people will ask questions and be more curious about this, but it is something for us to level the playing field a little bit more, even in medical research.
Thank you. Mr. Brookins?
Sure. I first want to start and give people listening or watching a website to check out, clinicaltrials.gov. That's clinicaltrials.gov. That is a website that pretty much lists all of the clinical trials that are out here, whether they're trials that have been terminated or trials that are currently ongoing. You can filter the trials based on a therapeutic area that you're interested in. And it also gives you ways of knowing who's conducting a trial, possibly, as well as who you can contact if you're possibly interested in participating. I think it's great that Dr. McGill actually has a clinical site here in Memphis, because with 7 years of actually monitoring clinical trials, I hardly ever have an opportunity to monitor a trial or visit a site in my city. I've been throughout Tennessee, but hardly ever Memphis, regardless of if it's a cardiovascular trial or CNS trial. And that's really dependent upon who's the sponsor of the studies they're actually working with. I believe I agree with Dr. McGill that research definitely is important. And it's also rewarding being a part of the advancement of clinical research. And I also want to ensure people understand as well that it's not the same type of research from years ago. We have something called informed consent that you must sign, and it's one of the most important things that I do in my job. Is before I look at anything, I need to ensure that this participant sign an informed consent form and ensure that informed consent provides all the information. You as a patient have to know the possible benefits of this study, but also the possible serious adverse events and negative cons or cons for participating in studies, so that you know everything there is to know to make a sound decision that you want to participate in the trial. I thank you for inviting me to have this great discussion. You know, I love to talk. I love talking about my career. I could talk for 5 hours about what I do. I hope you get a lot of questions, and maybe we can have a follow-up discussion at some point, especially once we start getting these studies and getting participation. And I think another good opportunity for us to later have a discussion on ways to actually get the word out better, and the resources in our community of how we can actually promote clinical awareness.
All right. I want to thank both of you today, and I have to give public disclosure. Both of my guests today are not just friends, they're families, associates. I see them all the time, and Mr. Brookins is my nephew. I thank you, Dr. McGill, and I thank you, Mr. Brookins, for being on the show today. But what's most important, I thank both of you for sharing with me on a view from the chair. And it's important to our citizens to know and be empowered with knowledge so we can take Memphis to the next level. I am so pleased that you shared today, and I will have you back because this seems to be a very important issue that we need to share information on. And I can't wait to see the questions from people who will view this podcast. Thank you again. I appreciate you. And I'll see you next time on A View from the Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Again, I want to thank you, our listeners and viewers. What, why, who, when? We're going to discuss all of that right here from A View from the Chair. I am your host, Patrice Jordan Robinson. We'll see you next time. Thank you.